Hello and welcome to the Unusual Stories podcast. My name is Wojciech Salski, I'll be your host for today. And before we start, may I just remind you, if you find this podcast useful, entertaining and exciting, or at least interesting enough for you to keep listening, then please make sure to share it with a friend and click the subscribe or follow button. It goes the long way. It's the best kind of advertising there is. And certainly, if you'd like to support the community and the podcast itself, that's the best way. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the podcast financially, or maybe just send me a brief email or a comment below with a sort of a pat on the back kind of message, then please feel free to do so. There is a link below for any sort of communication with me, and I'm grateful for all of you that do, and it really does go a long way. So if you are one of those, and you are, then please take my deepest gratitude. And for all of you that are listening, just keep listening. I guess that's why we're here for, right? That's why I am here. And so it gives me great pleasure for, the ability to continue doing this. Now, before we start as well, please pardon my stuffy kind of nose sound. I don't know how much you can hear it. I definitely do. I've been a little bit ill recently, mostly because of the stress. I finished my exams the other day, the first exams of many, really, in my qualification process for accounting and auditing. And so I'm coming back to this in a manner that is probably not at my best. But nevertheless, I'm hoping to deliver, and today might just be one of the most controversial and difficult, in a way, topics for me to raise, which is also why, to be honest, I would invite you to keep an open mind and, most importantly, have courage to doubt, and also have courage to doubt what I'm gonna tell you, because as we delve into the topics of this week's book, as we delve into the topics that one could consider controversial, and in many places, in many groups, one could even say they are not to be discussed. I certainly found so with some of my friends. Then have courage to doubt. And, I'll share with you some of ideas that I took away from this book. I'll raise 3 major points that I think the book sort of addresses. And I'll also discuss 2 most important, in my opinion, needs and values that all of us should take part in maintaining. And in a way, this series of books is actually an exclamation mark, a highlight of those 2 qualities: the courage to doubt and the need for free speech. So please be mindful of your own bias and doubt. And if at any point in the episode you think, this is not for me, I would encourage you to still keep going, to finish, and to understand that, maybe this is the point to make. We need to be able to hear things that might feel uncomfortable. The moment we stop being able to do so, we lose the amazing quality of self-control and the navigation. In a way, it's like a boat losing a rudder, because we no longer are able to self-correct. So, a good example of this would be if I say something offensive to a person on the street and they punch me in the face because they feel offended. That's maybe not the greatest reaction from their side, but it's certainly a reaction that allows me to self-correct. I know that I should probably not say that to that person ever again. And whether it was something good or bad, this could be argued. It is very subjective. What one thinks is good, another might find bad. But the importance of discourse, the need for us to be able to speak, is very tightly related to our ability to make sense of the world. We think in words inside of us, and we also self-correct and think as we exchange ideas with others. The moment you censor yourself or others from exchanging ideas, you disallow them the ability to think through things, and that's very dangerous. Most importantly, that's counterproductive and certainly counter-developing. It's you cannot muzzle someone just because you don't like what they say. It's one thing to not like what another person thinks or says. It's another thing to censor them to the point that they don't have the option to say what they think. I believe, and maybe you don't agree with me, and that's completely fair, although I would argue that free speech is essential, and with all my heart I'd like to foster a space in this world where I have the ability to say what I think. And the one exclusion maybe to free speech which I can accept is inciting to violence, immediate invitation to violence. That I agree that is wrong, and especially in social media or on public platforms, I would say it's completely not okay to invite people to violence, and in any way. That's why when you're out in public and you start inviting people to violence, you're probably going to be self-corrected very quickly by someone either stopping you, maybe it's the police, or someone else just punching you in the face and making you stop. Unfortunately, online, people can use their voices in a way that is less accountability prone. Potentially someone could post anonymously, maybe someone pretends to be someone and they are not. Maybe it's a bot posting and not an actual person. And so the internet is definitely one of those areas where free speech can take a darker turn. Nevertheless, though, I would argue that as long as you're not inciting violence, you should be allowed, you have the right to say what you think. And you have the right to discuss things, because as we said earlier, it's a big part of our ability to make sense of the world. And similarly, we have to have the courage to doubt what we think is true and to doubt what others tell us is true. And I think this person in particular, as much as he's been again and again attacked for his perceptions and for his approaches, is one of those people that has the courage to doubt what is true. And in my opinion, he's an admirable and definitely one of the, from my perspective, good guys in terms of the political discourse these days out there. So without further ado, I would like to discuss today the book by Robert F. Kennedy, one of the presidential candidates in the recent elections in 2024 for president in the United States, and Mr. Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And just for context, if you don't know anything at all, maybe something to note is Mr. Kennedy has a law background. For a long time, he's been a part of a movement and a sort of a law dedicated agency to fight with big corporations, mostly on the grounds of environmental pollution. And recently, over the past few years, he has become a huge advocate for health and sort of for fighting the big pharma, the big agencies, big corporations of both big food and big pharma that are apparently in many ways controlling both media and the regulatory bodies, especially in the United States, that set the rules for the health themselves. So, this episode, as I said, I'm going to try to do my best. I have my notes on the computer for a change, because I've just made I've done so many of them that I've decided to use my notes online as well and sort of corroborate with artificial intelligence to put them together. And as I said, this is probably one of the most mysterious and difficult topics that I've had a chance to encounter. I've read the book from the beginning till the end. It's not an easy read. It's not a pleasant read. Quite frankly, it's not a read you want to read, but it might just be similarly to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, or maybe similarly to the Creature from Jekyll Island book. It might just be one of those books that you need to read, even if only so you have the courage to face those questions that Mr. Kennedy both poses and answers throughout his work. And so maybe, let's see, I'll jump in and I'll see where we go. So first and foremost, I'd like to tell you a little story about the way in which, unfortunately, colonialism is not finished yet. So a big part of Kennedy's book treats on the topic of exploitation of the African continent and African people, as well as other sort of developed countries and nations out there, by the big pharma and the big corporations and conglomerates of the world. Obviously, majority of those corporations are either in Europe or United States, which is not a surprise, but there are also big corporations from China and other major players on the board of the world that played a huge part in this tragedy. So Mr. Kennedy, and I will read out some of my notes here and then I'll sort of elaborate on them. Mr. Kennedy alleges that Dr. Anthony Fauci, and Anthony Fauci at the moment is the head of the NIH, which is one of the organizations, health organizations as they call them, mostly focused on research in terms of pharmaceutical, research. And the name, you might have heard that name because especially throughout COVID-19 pandemic, the name of Anthony Fauci was on everyone's lips, mostly due to the fact that he was supposedly the expert and the sort of the major decision maker and advocate for all of those, one could say, draconian laws that were introduced across the countries, whether it was about wearing the mask or whether it was about staying indoors, keeping some sort of distance from one another, or getting your vaccine. Mr. Fauci was the speaker for all of this, and for many people he was the person to go for advice to, and so the whole book, The Real Anthony Fauci by Robert Kennedy, treats on this particular individual. Mr. Kennedy lays out for us at the beginning of the book the story behind Mr. Fauci, his experience, and then his rise to power. And I'll share with you the three major topics But as I said, it's one of those books. It's just too dense for me to explore in detail, and I'd also encourage you to have the courage to try. So, as I said, Kennedy alleges that Mr. Fauci and pharmaceutical companies have used African populations as subjects for experimental treatments without proper ethical considerations. He discusses instances where experimental HIV treatments and vaccines were tested in African countries, often without adequate informed consent or oversight. Kennedy argues that these practices reflect a broader pattern of exploiting vulnerable populations for medical experimentation. Now, before I read for you the quote from the book here, I just wanted to point out to you, a big advantage we have, meaning we people living maybe in UK or maybe in the United States, somewhere in Europe, is we tend to have better oversight and regulation regarding many different areas of experimenting and consumer sort of rights, safety. So, for example, in the same way that when you go to the store and for the most part you can expect that what is advertised you will be buying is true and similar to what you are actually buying, in many countries around the world, in places and areas which are more impoverished, more corrupted and less regulated, it is much easier to tell people one thing and offer them another. And so these are the very sad and tragic, quite frankly, overwhelmingly tragic stories that Robert Kennedy explores in his book, in which he points out to many different pharmaceutical treatments that were experimentally tested on people across the African continent and not only, for the benefit of the pharmaceutical industry, without them, meaning the subjects of these experiments, even knowing. So, for example, they would be told that this is a vaccine against, insert here whichever disease you'd like, maybe against malaria, while simultaneously within that jab that they were offered, there would be some sort of other medicine being treated and experimented on, for example, to see whether or not it can stop people from being fertile, and or for example, whether or not this experimental HIV treatment can help people with HIV and AIDS. So, I know this just sounds so absurdly wrong that one could argue this is impossible. How can we live in a world that people do such things? But, if you've lived long enough and you have eyes wide open long enough, you can anticipate that there is a certain amount of evil in this world, and I have no doubt that there are people that are taking advantage of the disadvantaged. And I'm afraid this book and Mr. Kennedy's fight for health of the world and for rights of those that have no rights at all in many countries reflect that. So the quote from the book is, "Fauci did the unthinkable and repeatedly violated federal laws to allow his pharma partners to use impoverished and dark-skinned children as lab rats in deadly experiments with toxic AIDS and cancer chemotherapies." Now, the point here obviously raises significant ethical concerns, right? Because the conduct of medical research that we know, I mean, if you expect your country to have some sort of ethical conduct of medical research, you probably don't consider this to be possible where an experimental and toxic substances are used on children or adults, quite frankly, anyone, without their consent or against their consent. While this is something that can take place, unfortunately, in countries that have no oversight and no control. If you think about it, in the same way that in Nazi Germany, the infamous Dr. Mengele had a chance to experiment on children, doing horrific experiments, things that are literally unthinkable to someone that has hopefully unthinkable to anyone who has at least a pinch of reason and love within their hearts. This could happen under a totalitarian regime, such as in Nazi Germany. In a similar way, in Russia under Stalin, there was no unthinkable things one could do to a prisoner once they entered this prison system of the Gulag, right? As we've explored in our episode on Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. So these regulations that we in our countries can consider to be an obvious thing are not necessarily even in a smallest way true for countries that don't have such control. In countries that are either impoverished by war or in countries that are run by tyrants or mafia, it is possible there to abuse laws and power. And unfortunately, it seems like, according to Kennedy's research, and feel free to explore the book and check all of the footnotes and go through all of this. I'll put the link below as well to the website that the book points to. I'll actually take a note here to give you that. It's unthinkable to think so, and yet it seems to be true that pharmaceutical companies, by creating subsidiaries or funding externally and just covering their tracks, can go to such lengths. And the allegations obviously prompt discussion on the context and the standards that are held. We're supposedly in such a civilized time. We have so many international agencies that are keeping peace, even though it's, funnily enough, not a peaceful time, or keeping health, even though there is so much unhealthy people around the world. And then, you encounter such a book, you encounter such topics, and you do wonder what is true. On this point, before I go to the next story, I'll put the link below as well to one of the episodes from Joe Rogan's podcast, which truly troubled me. It's an episode with an interview with Siddharth Kara, a gentleman who researches and sort of highlights the problems of the supply chain for such materials as cobalt. So I don't know if you know, but apparently cobalt is one of those materials that is basically present in any sort of electronic device we hold, whether it's your phone or your laptop, whatever you're listening on, it's probably in there. And unfortunately, he exposes the huge lie that organizations have to live with, because according to Mr. Kara, they have to know, or at least they have to be willfully blind to that knowledge, he exposes the fact that the majority of cobalt around the world is sourced from one place and one place only, which is the Congo, and about the troubling, horrific state of affairs there and how people are abused and used to mine this cobalt in inhumane ways. And so I'll put the link below here, but it's just to drive the point home that, you know, we seem to maybe by being ignorant, maybe by not thinking about these things, maybe simply by wishing, you know, to look away, deciding not to act upon it, or maybe just by not knowing, which, you know, up until last year I didn't know about this, up until a few months ago I didn't know about the cobalt. We allow these things to happen around the world, and we live, you know, in, as we talked about this last week, I can be living in this comfort with all these pleasant things and planning to buy myself my electric car to be so energy efficient and environmentally friendly. At the same time, my ability to get this environmentally friendly car with an environmentally friendly battery made of cobalt, there is someone out there suffering immensely for me to be able to do this. And, you know, obviously it's not like I'm gonna now stop using all my devices and become a nomad to feel better about this. I already have these things, and for me, maybe the least I can do is to share with you these troubling thoughts and in a way help raise this issue and make people think, because I have no doubt that if everyone knew about these problems, it would be much more difficult for big corporations and for a few really evil individuals to perpetrate such crimes. So, you know, this is a part of this courage to speak up and courage to doubt, that the moment we choose not to discuss a topic because it's just too troubling for us, in a way we're enabling those that take advantage of that topic. And so I wish for us both, me and you, my dear listener, to have the courage and humility to speak up and to talk about these things, and to not look away the moment it becomes too troubling. You know, there rarely is a time during my podcast recordings when I feel such weight of the things I speak about as I feel, for example, right now. And 2 weeks ago I also felt as such. I felt that these episodes, because of their seriousness and because of the troubling, potentially world-shattering truths that they may hold, they challenge, you know, my sense of mission and also my ability to convey them. So, you know, it's truly a horrific idea to entertain, and yet I would like us to be able to entertain those ideas, and I'll share about that in a moment a bit more. So the second topic I'd like to raise from the book is the obvious conflict of interest, which I mentioned earlier, and regulatory capture that seems to be a plague of the United States in particular. But I have no doubt that if such a country as United States managed to be overrun by agencies that are regulatory captured agencies for organizations to lobby their beneficial for them deals, basically, and push through some practices and experimental products that might not otherwise be accepted publicly, I'm pretty sure such a problem and such a plague is also a part and parcel of many other countries in quote-unquote civilized and free world. So on this point, Mr. Kennedy asserts that regulatory agencies such as FDA or CDC have been compromised by financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. You know, a big part of it is also the media. Obviously, many legacy media channels, and when I say legacy media, I mean the media that you have on your average Joe's TV set. You know, a podcast that you listen to is not a contemporary media. I don't have any sponsors. There is no advertising apart from maybe the podcast itself and obviously the books that I encourage you to read or ideas I encourage you to explore. And so, you know, in many ways, obviously I'm not independent of my own work. Like, I'm still myself, Wojtek, with my books, my ideas, my channel. So I couldn't say I'm independent, but I am independent in a sense that because I don't advertise for any company out there, no one can, for example, blackmail me by saying, please, you know, if you don't, they wouldn't even say please, would they? If you don't advertise this book or this item on your channel, we will do XYZ, or we will stop funding your channel. The independence of channels such as podcasts these days is obviously a huge advantage over the likely lack of independence of media that rely on advertising fees, for example. So just think about it for a moment. At the moment, in a way that I do my podcast, even let's assume 5 years down the road when I do actually have a bigger studio and maybe I have someone to help me with all the editing and recording, because it's such a small endeavor that I can do it pretty much, you know, on a bootstrap budget on my own, I don't need to rely on anyone funding me. You know, it's great if someone supports me financially, but it's not the end of the world if they don't. If it was, I wouldn't be doing the podcast in the first place. That's the great advantage of such sources, right? Because if you can start a YouTube channel basically for free and get yourself a microphone for, I don't know, £50, probably the computer itself would be the most expensive, but still you could potentially also record yourself on the phone, and I don't think the quality would be that different. You can start a podcast anytime, anywhere, and you don't need to rely on huge grants or fees from, for example, pharmaceutical companies advertising online or advertising on screen. And this is the problem with the media, for example, you know, obviously in the United States, but I'm pretty sure it's the problem of the media, period, that in many ways, these companies become captured by their advertisers. Since the company relies on advertising as a means of making profit, because, you know, how many people actually pay for watching TV versus how many advertisers pay to show people their advertising on that TV, then you become reliant as that legacy media on the advertising itself. And then later on, if, for example, you decide to make a program that is not in line with whoever is pulling the strings, they could just say, well, if you do this, we will stop funding your XYZ. And in a similar way, unfortunately, FDA or CDC and such companies are apparently financially tied to the pharmaceutical industry. And it is no secret that in the United States, a big part of the political discourse is related to money. You know, there is an open lobbying facilitation taking place, and it is a part and parcel of the so-called democratic And I do think it's still democratic in a way, because anyone could fund you. It's just a matter of who has the bigger pocket, let's say deeper pocket, to fund you, and who has the integrity to speak up about these things. The system in itself has enabled a situation in which people who should be refereeing the match are also sponsored and paid by people playing the game. This is basically my take on how regulatory bodies of pharmaceutical industry are paid by pharmaceutical companies needing to make profits. And Mr. Kennedy claims that these agencies prioritize the interests of the pharmaceutical companies over public health due to the funding dependencies. And, this sort of, this problem is obviously undermining hugely the public trust, and also compromises the integrity of health policies, because the moment, and this is world-shattering news, if this is first time you're hearing about this and you're skeptical, then good for you. Be skeptical, dive deeper, read the book. As I said, I could also be telling completely crazy things, and that's for you to determine. That's the whole point of free speech in the first place, right? I'm saying on the podcast what I think is beneficial for you to hear, and you can take it or leave it. You can do anything about it as you wish. The problem is that the main point is we should be able to talk about these things, and this problem in particular seems to be greatly problematic because it's our health that's on the line. I don't want in an ideal world, I want to go to my doctor when I have a problem and be able to get unsolicited advice that truly holds my health as the greatest value, right? Otherwise, why am I going to the doctor? Like, if I'm going to the doctor to get advice on my health, but the doctor actually has my health as the second priority, and the first priority is to be able to sell this new product that his sponsor in this organization that apparently sponsors my doctor right now offers, then even though for my health maybe the best advice would be, oh yeah, just go work out more and eat less crap, he could say, oh, there's this great, medicine that I can help you. It will cost you a little bit, but, your health is very important for us. And so you can take this and continue with your life as you do. And notice the problem here. It's a conflict of interest, right? Not only am I not getting the advice that I should be getting, I'm also paying for getting a wrong advice and potentially, taking part in a scam, because now I'm taking some sort of medicine that for whatever reason might not be the right one, or, I don't like putting things into my body unless I know what they are. It's a big part of consuming things. We want to know what's on our plate, right? Unless, you close your eyes and you just allow things to happen to you. But I like to know what I eat. I like to know what kind of medicine I'm taking, even though I might not understand it fully. But that's why I trust the doctor. The problem is the moment I cannot trust the doctor anymore, well, isn't that the moment when I have no one to turn to when I have health issues? And, the quote here to drive home from the book is, Dr. Fauci uses the financial clout at his disposal in a backhanded manner to wield extraordinary influence over hospitals, universities, journals, and thousands of influential doctors and scientists whose careers and institutions he has the power to ruin, advance, or reward in an authoritarian manner. So, as you will read in the book, because of the position Dr. Fauci holds, he has the advantage of basically giving funding or taking away funding from practicing individuals and agencies. And in that sense, he is in charge of what true or what right is. This is the totalitarian state at its finest. In the same way, coming back to the example of my podcast, if, for example, there was a friend that was funding my podcast, and without him I wouldn't be able to use this room, I wouldn't be able to use this laptop, I wouldn't have all these things and ability to take time to do so, then if that friend would say, on your podcast every 5 minutes you have to advertise my new brand of pens, what can I do? Or maybe even worse, it wouldn't be an advertisement. Maybe the person that is funding my podcast in that hypothetical manner, in this story, maybe they say, I can only run my podcast if I'll be telling a lie. Maybe there is some reason that I should be telling you one thing and not the other. And in this manner, the person is controlling what I can say. This is the censorship at its finest, just from a different angle. Instead of me being censored what not to say, I'm just told what to say, period. And this is huge problem. This is the same huge problem that we might just have with every other controversial topic out there these days. It seems to me that, unfortunately, unless you are independent as a media organization, whether because you're small enough, like my podcast, that no one really cares and no one funds it, or because you're so big, like Joe Rogan's podcast, that so many people listen to you that you beat the records of listeners in comparison to even the radio stations, the major radio stations in the country. Yeah, Google that. That's true. You have to respond to the pressure. And if you are a part of this, media being sponsored by organizations such as pharmaceutical companies, which have huge amounts of money spent every year on advertising, you are not independent, and you are more likely to tell a lie because you have no other choice. And this is a big problem and conflict of interest at its finest. Now, of course, as I said, I don't know if you've heard, but Robert Kennedy Jr., as he ran for presidency in 2024, he later endorsed Donald Trump and ran on the, such as, Donald Trump had this motto, "Make America Great Again." Mr. Kennedy changed it to "Make America Healthy Again," and that's sort of his take on what he wishes Donald Trump's administration to do, starting in their cadency in 2025. And this is, I think, the pinnacle of the point. What. As much as I can be skeptical about the claims that both Mr. Kennedy shares in his book, as well as, echoed by the many independent and potentially, one could say, controversial or conspiratorial, that's the buzzwords of the day, I think, channels seem to share in terms of the, big pharma or the regulatory capture in many ways in the United States and elsewhere. I always look for the motives, and I try to explore the topic from the perspective of what the person actually does, rather what they say they will. Because a big problem with politics these days, and in general, I think, is you have to divide the wheat from the chaff, right? You don't know what's true until you check it And in many ways, since people are making claims, until these claims are fulfilled, we don't know who's telling the truth and who's lying. And looking into Mr. Kennedy's background and his experience with fighting with big corporations on the ground of environmental catastrophes, I have the courage to say and endorse him as a good guy, in terms of, I really think, unless, this is a huge lie, and that's another level of lies, but I doubt it. I think he is the good guy out there, actually trying to make, America, and not only America, in general, I think the world, a healthier place. And since health is the most important thing we all have and we all might lose, it's definitely one of the biggest topics that you should explore if any of these controversial topics of the season you find interesting or troubling enough for you to care. Now, let's dive even deeper, and this is the biggest of them all and the most troubling. Sorry for my stuffy nose, I'll just take a drink here. Yeah, I'm not sponsored, so pretend you've not seen that. But that's funny though. This is Corona, and we're about to talk about coronavirus. Now, long story short, and this, I think, why not? I'll share with you my experience of COVID. I think that was also really eye-opening for me in many ways. So I was one of the student representatives at Aberystwyth University Student Union. And when COVID happened, at the very beginning, similarly to the whole world, it was kind of like, it's nothing. This is just a joke. Oh, we'll be back at work in 2 weeks. And so, well, obviously we weren't. And over time, I noticed that there were two types. Obviously, there's more types of people, but during COVID, it seems to me that there were two major groups of people and two major groups of attitudes in terms of what to do about it. So, and at my work, it was especially sort of contrasting and visible. So me and one of my friends we were at the time already quite interested in alternative medicine, which is funny because it's not alternative, it's actually the natural medicine. So, the term alternative medicine is usually used by contemporary medicine, so organizations that actually make money on keeping people healthy, supposedly, to discriminate against health practices that are not profit making. I would say that's basically it. Feel free to challenge me on this. This is my perspective, and I'm happy to share it. It seems to me that the health industry does not really like what it cannot profit on, and I think that was particularly highlighted throughout COVID, when any sort of alternative, quote unquote, therapies were discredited as crazy or just conspiratorial, absurd, and not true. And instead, many, the major promotion was offered to vaccines that are developed by companies, which are funding, obviously, the Dr. Fauci's group in power, and these regulatory bodies that were telling us what to do, primarily. And now, what I've noticed around my workplace was that since me and my friend did not really pay too much attention to this whole story of, the world being in a pandemic, and it's not like I did not abide by the rules. I had to abide by the rules, so I did. That's the whole point of rules. I didn't really, think it's such a big problem. It didn't seem to me that it will be such a big problem. I thought, And I still think it was just another flu, just a very well advertised flu. And I do wonder, to what degree, even just by saying this, I'm infuriating, whoa, that's a word, I'm annoying some people out there. And of course, if you're one of those people, I'm sorry to trouble you. At the same time, as I said, I might be talking complete crazy. Like that's my thing, in a sense that I have the right to free speech, and so do you. So I'm happy to share my point of view, and if it's wrong, you don't have to take it. That's completely fine. Not everything that you find online will be for you, right? That's the whole point. What I found, though, was that there was a group of people in our workplace who became so scared of the COVID, pandemic, that basically all they would think about all day, and we would start the day like that, was the death count, the stories of people dying, the troublesome news from across the globe. And I don't know much about medicine, but I know that if you're worried and if you're stressed and if you're fearful, your immune system is down. Like, that's literally why my nose is stuffy right now, which maybe is just another synchronicity, just God wanting me to share with you this troublesome book and drive the point home. I've been stressing over the past few weeks about my exams, and so my immune system was, hindered by this. And so I caught a cold the other week, and I'm still feeling slightly sluggish, but I'm getting over it. Over COVID, some of my friends and some of my colleagues and people I knew were so terrified of everything. And obviously, it's not difficult to be terrified if you keep watching news that are 24/7 telling you how many people died. Their immune system was definitely down, and like, even if it wasn't COVID, I wouldn't be surprised if they were ill with other diseases over time just because of all that stress. The point I'm trying to make here is, though, however your experience was throughout that time, and however unlucky you might have been, because I can imagine that there are still people out there that did lose someone close to them and did, find that time to be the most horrific time of their lives. And a big part of the quality of life we've had throughout those times was how you go about it. I really truly believe it to be the case. So if you allowed yourself to be in a panic mode 24/7 and stay away from people, alienate yourself, don't keep to your routines, maybe just watch TV and eat delivery food and binge on Netflix and order crazy stuff on Amazon just for the sake of ordering, then you probably had a bad time. My time in the pandemic was especially great because I had more time in my day to do things I never had time to do. So I started the podcast during the pandemic. I wrote my first book during the pandemic. And slightly after. It's what you make of it, And so now, as I did this tangent on my pandemic experience, which wasn't that bad, I did get ill. I got the jabs. I hope those jabs were okay. I don't know what was in them. I doubt anyone knows what was in them, but fair play, whatever. I got them. That was the part of the deal of me being able to go home to see my family. That was the most important thing. I wanted to be able to see my loved ones, so I did, get the job. And the point here is, though, it was an experience that we all went through, and there were some people in charge that were telling us what is good and what is bad. And now history seems to be slowly but surely showing us a different side to that experience. And Mr. Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, is definitely majorly troubling on the front of the COVID pandemic. And so I'll read out to you my notes a little bit and the quote here. So Kennedy basically criticizes Dr. Fauci's management of the COVID pandemic, alleging that he suppressed alternative treatments in favor of promoting vaccines developed by pharmaceutical companies with which he had close ties. And he argues that this approach led to unnecessary deaths and prolonged the pandemic. He also claims that Dr. Fauci's policies were influenced more by financial interest than by scientific evidence. And for this particular one, if you're listening to my podcast and you've not stopped this episode by now and decided to delete this account and maybe even criticize me online and never look at my fairly average, I would expect, face again, then you might have come across Joe Rogan's podcast. And Joe Rogan was one of the more vocal people throughout the pandemic who advertised, and sort of vouched for natural treatments and off-the-shelf, much cheaper alternatives to what the pharmaceutical companies which were developing these vaccines were offering. And as a disclosure, I think vaccines in general are one of the multitude of amazing discoveries and inventions that we have. I have no doubt that there are vaccines that are helping us and saving us. And as a child, I was vaccinated against a bunch of different diseases that I have no doubt would be a problem if I did not get these vaccines. The thing is, though, it's a very different story when vaccines are developed by companies who are in charge of dealing and have that and will benefit greatly from getting these vaccines into people's arms and legs and shoulders and whatever. And most importantly, a very troubling thing that Mr. Kennedy points out is there came a time, and I don't remember exactly when, so pardon me on that and look it up, but there was a resolution that went through in the United States which allowed the organizations developing vaccines to not be legally liable for the side effects of these vaccines. And now you heard it right, that's very troubling, right? It's as if you went to a restaurant to eat pizza and the pizza maker would not be liable legally for making sure that this pizza does not kill you. Basically, it means that they are absolved of any responsibility. I wouldn't trust anyone with anything in relation to my health if they were not responsible for the decisions they make. I don't want to go to a doctor and get advice if that doctor has no responsibility to make this advice in my best interest. It's yet again another example of a conflict of interest, right? So, as the quote here, and I'll read the quote in a second, I'll just finish. So the point I'm making here is yet again the conflict of interest in this situation makes us pose questions about the necessity, the timeliness, and most importantly, the actual practical impact of these, medicines that were given to us. And I don't know, time will tell. The big problem about things we consume is we don't see the results of things we consume or, inject into our bodies long after. And it takes a great amount of time and number of control studies to be able to decide whether or not something is safe to use. Now, that was completely overridden throughout COVID. So suddenly, even though an average development of a vaccine takes approximately, from what I remember from the book, something like 10 or 15 years, suddenly these vaccines were developed within a year or two. And one could argue that there was not enough time simply for them to be checked whether they are safe. And obviously they weren't checked. Like, that's the whole point that Mr. Kennedy is arguing. Now, on this note, I just want to raise a question for you in terms of anything that you're using. You know, I've been smoking cigarettes for quite some time, up until a year, 2 years ago. So I stopped smoking cigarettes at the beginning of last year. Not this year, but last year. Well, I stopped cigarettes a while back. We know now that cigarettes are really bad for your health, right? The thing is, to do studies on how cigarettes develop, for example, help to develop cancer over time in one's body, it takes time. It's not like you will smoke one cigarette and suddenly you have cancer. In the same way, even though now many of my friends are using those vape pens or like snus, tobacco in a different form, maybe they're no longer smoking it, maybe now they're vaping it or whatever. Yet again, these things are supposedly more healthy than cigarettes. The thing is, though, we don't know how healthy they are. It's simply because these are new products that we don't know. We don't have enough time with people actually using them for us to be able to say whether or not they are healthy. Maybe in 20 years' time or 10 years' time, we will know that these are also cancerous. Personally, I think they are 100%. I wouldn't be surprised if they are as bad or even worse than the cigarettes, the classic cigarettes, if you will. The point I'm trying to make here is, though, in so many ways, you want the organizations and people who are producing these things to be responsible, because it gives them the incentive to make these things safer. If there is no incentive to make things safe, why would I care? If I'm only looking for profit and I can get the profit as quickly as possible just simply by advertising fear and making people do what I tell them to do without me having any repercussions and responsibility, then why wouldn't I do that? And I know this is a troubling topic to discuss, and I know that you might be, disagreeing with me on these points, but I don't think you will disagree that you want to know that the person who gives you their product is responsible for what that product will do to you. It's a very important part of our ability, our social contract. Otherwise, if I'm not responsible for my actions, who is? And if I don't have any incentive to act right, why would I act right when the opportunity is there? There is a saying in Polish that an opportunity makes a thief. And in the same way, I would argue that an opportunity makes a profit. Sometimes not necessarily an ethical one. Anyway, the quote I would like to share on this point with you is this one. Suddenly, those trusted institutions seem to be acting in concert to generate fear, promote obedience, discourage critical thinking, and herd 7 billion people to march to a single tune, culminating in mass public health experiments with a novel, shoddily tested and improperly licensed technology so risky that manufacturers refused to produce it unless every government on earth shielded them from liability. They were literally absolved of responsibility for what these vaccines will do to us. I leave to you what you want to think about this. Obviously, as I said, I think we should not blame the tool, right? You can use a knife to kill a person and you can use a knife to save their life. In the same way, you can use a vaccine to save a person and you can use a vaccine to kill them. I have no doubt that there are tons of very good doctors and tons of very good medicine. But I have also, at this point in my life, no doubt that there are people out there and organizations that will do whatever they can and take whatever they can for their own benefit. And that is a troubling thought. But as I said earlier, I would like you to have the courage to have those thoughts and to doubt. And even if this means you will have to rethink what you think about that whole time, so be it, you know. History is for us if anything, a lesson. And hopefully it's a lesson learned. The thing is, though, to learn, you really need to actively engage with the material, you know. If you turn away the gaze, or if you pretend nothing happened and you don't know what I'm talking about, then you probably won't learn from it. Now, on this note, I just realized that we've been going on at it for a while. I would like to finish with this point. So I said earlier, right, that we need to have the ability to discuss things, and we need to have the ability of free speech. Our ability to ask questions and doubt is basically a safeguard against someone taking advantage of us, or against tyranny as whole. So if you do see censorship happening in the media, or censorship happening in social media, I would encourage you to fight against it. There is nothing more vicious than a state or an organization or a person that is taking advantage of others by making people not be able to speak their mind and not be able to ask questions. We should not be prosecuted for asking questions. We should not be prosecuted for saying what we think. The only thing, as I said earlier, that should be censored is inciting to direct violence. And I agree, that's the one thing that no one should be allowed to do, because that's simply wrong. Now, there is this phenomenon that Jordan Peterson extensively talks about, which also explains, and for me it makes sense, why people choose not to discuss things that trouble them. So I'll tell you an example. Let's say that you have a relationship and, you know, your partner is, you've been together for a very long time and you love one another, you know that your partner loves you, it's great. Imagine that at some point you learn that your partner has been cheating on you and that they've been cheating on you for, let's say, 5 years. Think how difficult this is for you to realize, because the moment you accept that it is true that they've been cheating on you and lying to you for 5 years, you have to ask yourself the question, what else in my life is a lie? What else in this world is not true? And this is why it's much more comfortable for us to turn away or to pretend we don't know, or to not ask uncomfortable questions, or to dismiss someone's idea as controversial, conspiratorial, or crazy. Because if something we learn is too troubling for us to accept, we have to find courage to ask ourselves what else we don't know, or what else is not true. And that is a very, very troubling thought. So, you know, in many ways, as I said earlier, I'm not surprised that you don't want to hear about this. And I'm not surprised that you might say that this is crazy. And I'm not surprised that you might not believe me. There is a part in you that tries to make sense of the world. This is what Jordan Peterson explains in Maps of Meaning, that will hold so strongly to a lie if that lie allows you to keep with your life without major changes. And that is why it's so taxing. It's so, heavy for us to learn something that is, world-shattering. It's like you build yourself a certain pyramid of ideas that you have about your relationship, and then suddenly, if it turns out that the person has been cheating on you for 5 years, then doesn't that mean that the whole pyramid needs to fall and another pyramid needs to be built? What else in this structure is not true? What other lie is there out there for us to discover? And, I don't want this episode, or I don't want these ideas to be like a call to not believe anything at all. Quite the contrary. I think the best way and the responsibility we have as thinking creatures, as participatory, citizens of our states, is exactly that: to ask these questions, to think, to doubt, and to look for sources, clues, and ideas. And, I've recently had an argument with my sister about one of the topics that one could consider controversial. And, it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to have these discussions. It's difficult to convince someone if they don't want to look at a certain area. It's also difficult to learn the other person's point of view if you don't allow yourself to listen to this person's opinions. So both I would like to send to my sister some, materials for her to look at, and I'd also like to see the materials that she's been looking at. In the same way, if you have a discussion with a friend, sometimes the only thing you can do is to share with them what you've been learning and hope that they will be open to listen. And I would just invite you to have the courage for these discussions and to have the courage to doubt and to wonder, to think about these things. And I truly do believe that there is truth out there for us to discover, and it's our responsibility, at least in the capacity that allows us to act skillfully in this world, to look for that truth and to be courageously asking for it. Now, the invitation for this week, of course, as long as you're still with me, and thank you for that if you are, I truly bow to you as a friend, because it's by far probably the hardest, the most difficult episode we've done. I would invite you to have the courage this week and in your life in general over the next, millennia that you're allowed to be on this planet. Have the courage to doubt and to discuss and to look for alternative sources, for alternative solutions, and to listen to alternative voices, and make sure to be the advocate for another person's free speech. Be strong enough to listen when you don't want to hear something. Be strong enough to discuss with people things that make you feel uncomfortable. It's a big part of being a strong and independent human being. And it's the best way for us to keep our sovereignty and our ability to be independent. Because the moment we start censoring others, and the moment we allow someone out there to censor ourselves, we become the victims of tyranny. And we know that this is not the right way to go. So, as I said, I'll put the links below to a bunch of different things and episodes that we've discussed. I'll link below the episode of Joe Rogan's discussing these cobalt mines with Siddharth Kara, and I also will put the new episode of Joe Rogan below which briefly discusses Dr. Fauci. Funnily enough, it showed up just today. And I'll also put the Gulag Archipelago episode, which I think is an episode relevant to this, certainly. And maybe Maps of Meaning. I think that would be also suitable for you. Anyway, thank you so much for staying. I truly do bow to you if you did, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. If you'd like to share with me either in a comment below or by following the link below and sending me a little email or a note, whatever, I'd love to hear from you, and I encourage you to read the book, The Real Anthony Fauci by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I hope that by asking these difficult questions and exploring these concepts, we will make the world a better place. So I truly do believe that and hope to do so. Anyway, have a wonderful, wonderful week, nevertheless, and stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.